Hey, third grade. Back in my hammock. Marcus is not outside talking today, so I feel like I can read from here. Before I start, James and the Giant Peach, I have to show you my shirt because I'm so excited about it, and I feel like it completely works with our story. It says, be somebody who makes everybody feel like somebody. And I feel like if Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker would take a little bit of that advice, maybe this would be a very different story. But here we go. Chapter 10. It was quite a large hole, the sort of thing an animal about the size of a fox might have made. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't just a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel. The tunnel was damp and murky, and all around him there was the curious, bittersweet smell of fresh peach. The floor was soggy under his knees, the walls were wet and sticky, and peach juice was dripping from the ceiling. James opened his mouth and caught some of it on his tongue. It tasted delicious. He was crawling uphill now, as though the tunnel were leading straight toward the very center of the gigantic fruit. Every few seconds, he paused and took a bite out of the wall. The peach flesh was sweet and juicy and marvelously refreshing. He crawled on for several more yards, and then suddenly, bang, the top of his head bumped into something extremely hard, blocking his way. He glanced up. In front of him, there was a solid wall that seemed at first as though it were made of wood. He touched it with his fingers. It certainly felt like wood, except that it was very jagged and full of deep grooves. Good heavens, he said, I know what this is. I've come to the stone in the middle of the peach. A lot of the time, especially in different areas of the world and in different times, they call things different things. And so the stone of the peach is like the peach pit. It's like what we would call the peach pit. Then he noticed that there was a small door cut into the face of the peach stone. He gave a push. It swung open. He crawled through it, and before he had time to glance up to see where he was, he heard a voice saying, "Look who's here!" And another one said, "We've been waiting for you." Here's James pushing on that little door of the peach pit, or the peach stone as they call it. James stopped and stared at the speakers, his face white with horror. He started to stand up, but his knees were shaking so much he had to sit down again on the floor. He glanced behind him, thinking he could bolt back into the tunnel the way he had come, but the doorway had disappeared. There was now only a solid brown wall behind him. Chapter 11. James's large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures? Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog. You could hardly call that an insect, could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog, sitting on a stool directly across the room from James. Next to the old green grasshopper, there was an enormous spider, and next to the spider, there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in a curled-up position, were a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm, but it was sleeping soundly and nobody was paying it any attention. Do you want to see what they look like? Check it out. So there's the grasshopper. Looks like the spider. And a ladybug, and a centipede, and the earthworm. And they're all just kind of sitting around on like sofas. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself. And in the strange greenish light that shone from somewhere in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. "I'm hungry," the spider announced suddenly, staring at James. "I'm famished," the old green grasshopper said. "So am I," the ladybug cried. The centipede sat up a little straighter on the sofa. "Everyone's famished," he said. "We need food." 4 pairs of round, black, glassy eyes were all fixed upon James. Excuse me. The centipede made a wriggling movement with his body as though he were about to glide off the sofa, but he didn't. There was a long pause and a long silence. The spider, who happened to be a female spider, opened her mouth and ran along, black tongue delicately over her lips. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked, suddenly leaning forward and addressing herself to James. Poor James was backed up against the far wall, shivering with fright and much too terrified to answer. "What's the matter with you?" asked the old green grasshopper. "You look positively ill." "He looks as though he's going to faint any second," the centipede said. "Oh my goodness, the poor thing," the ladybug cried. "I do believe he thinks that it's him we're going to eat." There was a roar of laughter among all sides. Oh dear, they said. "What an awful thought. You mustn't be frightened," the ladybug said kindly. "We wouldn't dream of hurting you. You are one of us now, don't you know that? You are one of the crew. We're all in the same boat." "We've been waiting for you all day long," the old green grasshopper said. "We thought you were never going to turn up. I'm glad you made it." "So cheer up, my boy, cheer up," the centipede said. "And meanwhile, I wish you'd come over here and give me a hand with these boots. It takes me hours to get them all off by myself." Chapter 12. James decided that this was most certainly not a time to be disagreeable. So he crossed the room to where the centipede was sitting and knelt down beside him. "Thank you so much," the centipede said. "You are very kind." "You have a lot of boots," James murmured. "I have a lot of legs," the centipede answered proudly, "and a lot of feet, 100 to be exact." "There he goes again," the earthworm cried, speaking for the first time. "He simply cannot stop telling lies about his legs. He doesn't have anything like 100 of them. He's only got 42. The trouble is that most people don't bother to count them. They just take his word for it. And anyway, there's nothing marvelous, centipede, about having lots of legs." "Poor fellow," the centipede said, whispering in James's ear. "He's blind, and he can't see how splendid I look." "In my opinion," the earthworm said, "the really marvelous thing is to have no legs at all and be able to walk just the same." "You call that walking?" cried the centipede. "You're a slitherer. That's all you are. You just slither along." "I glide," said the earthworm primly. "You are a slimy beast," answered the centipede. "I am not a slimy beast," the earthworm said. "I am a useful and much loved creature. Ask any gardener you like. And as far as you, I am a pest," the centipede announced, grinning broadly and looking around the room for approval. "He is so proud of that," the ladybug said, smiling at James, "though for the life of me I cannot understand why." "I'm the only pest in the room," cried the centipede, still grinning away. "Unless you count old green grasshopper over there. But he has long past it now. He's too old to be a pest anymore." The old green grasshopper turned his huge black eyes upon the centipede and gave him a withering look. "Young fellow," he said, speaking in a deep, slow, scornful voice, "I have never been a pest in my life. I am a musician." "Hear, hear," said the ladybug. "James," the centipede said. Your name is James, isn't it?" "Yes." "Well, James, have you ever in your life seen such a marvelous colossal centipede as me?" "I certainly haven't," James answered. "How on earth did you get to be like that?" And here he is with all of his boots. There's James helping him with all of his boots. Check it out. "Very peculiar," the centipede said. "Very, very peculiar indeed. Let me tell you what happened. I was messing about in the garden under the old peach tree, and suddenly a funny little green thing came wriggling past my nose, bright green as it was and extraordinarily beautiful, and it looked like some kind of tiny stone or crystal." "Oh, but I know what that is," cried James. "It happened to me too," said the ladybug. "And me," Miss Spider said. "Suddenly there were little green things everywhere, and the soil was full of them." "I actually swallowed one," the earthworm declared proudly. "So did I," the ladybug said. "I swallowed 3, the centipede cried. "But who's telling the story anyways? Don't interrupt." "It's too late to tell stories now," the old green grasshopper announced. "It's time to go to sleep." "I refuse to sleep in my boots," the centipede cried. How many more are there to come off, James? I think I've done about 20 so far, James told him. Then that leaves 80 to go, the centipede said. 22! Not 80, shrieked the earthworm. He's lying again, the centipede roared with laughter. Stop pulling the earthworm's leg, the ladybug said. This sent the centipede into hysterics. Pulling his leg, he cried, wriggling with glee and pointing at the earthworm. Which leg am I pulling? You tell me that. James decided he rather liked the centipede. He was obviously a rascal, but what a change it was to hear somebody laughing once in a while. He had never heard Aunt Sponge or Aunt Spiker laughing out loud in all the time he had been with them. We really must get some sleep, the old green grasshopper said. We've got a tough day ahead of us tomorrow. So, would you be so kind, Miss Spider, to make the beds? Chapter 13. A few minutes later, Miss Spider had made the first bed. It was hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope of threads at either end, so that it actually looked more like a hammock. Oh, like bed. Than a bed. But it was a magnificent affair, and the stuff that it was made of shimmered like silk in the pale light. I do hope you'll find it comfortable, Miss Spider said to the old green grasshopper. I made it as soft and silky as I possibly could. I spun it with gossamer. That's a much better quality thread than the one I use for my own web. Thank you so much, my dear lady, the old green grasshopper said, climbing into the hammock. Ah, this is just what I needed. Good night, everybody. Good night. Then Miss Spider spun the next hammock, and Ladybug got in. After that, she spun a long one for the centipede and an even longer one for the earthworm. And how do you like your bed? She said to James when it came to his turn. Hard or soft? I like it soft, thank you very much, James answered. For goodness sake, stop staring around the room and get on with my boots, the centipede said. You and I are never going to get any sleep at this rate. And kindly line them up neatly in pairs after you take them off. Don't just throw them over your shoulder. James worked away frantically on the centipede's boots. Each one had laces that had to be untied, loosened, before it could be pulled off. And to make matters worse, all the laces were tied up in the most complicated knots that had to be unpicked with fingernails. It was just awful. It took about 2 hours. And by the time James had pulled off the last boot of all and lined them up in a row on the floor, 21 pairs altogether, the centipede was fast asleep. Wake up, centipede, whispered James, giving him a gentle dig in the stomach. It's time for bed. Thank you, my dear child, the centipede said, opening his eyes. And then he got down off the sofa and ambled across the room and crawled into his hammock. James got into his own hammock, and oh, how soft and comfortable it was compared with the hard, bare boards that his aunts had always made him sleep upon at home. Lights out, the centipede drowsily said. Nothing happened. Turn out the light, he called, raising his voice. James glanced around the room, wondering which of the others he might be talking to, but they were all asleep. The old green grasshopper was snoring loudly through his nose. The ladybug was making whistling noises as she breathed, and the earthworm was coiled up like a spring at one end of his hammock, wheezing and blowing through his open mouth. As for Miss Spider, she had made a lovely web for herself across one corner of the room, and James could see her crouching right in the very center of it, mumbling softly in her dreams. I said, turn out the light, shouted the centipede angrily. Are you talking to me? Of course I'm not talking to you, the centipede answered. That crazy glowworm has gone to sleep with her light on. For the first time since entering the room, James glanced up at the ceiling, and there he saw a most extraordinary sight. Something that looked like a gigantic fly without wings. It was at least 3 feet long. It was standing upside down upon its 6 legs in the middle of the ceiling, and the tail end of this creature seemed to be literally on fire. A brilliant greenish light, as bright as the brightest electric bulb, was shining out of its tail and lighting up the whole room. Is that a glowworm? Asked James, staring at the light. It doesn't look like a worm of any sort to me. Of course it's a glowworm, the centipede answered. At least that's what she calls herself. Although actually you are quite right. She isn't really a worm at all. Glowworms are never worms. They're simply lady fireflies without wings. Wake up, you lazy beast! But the glowworm didn't stir, so the centipede rushed out of his hammock and picked up one of his boots from the floor. Put out that wretched light, he shouted, hurling the boot up at the ceiling. The glowworm slowly opened one eye and stared at the centipede. There is no need to be rude, she said, all in good time. Come on, shouted the centipede, or I'll put it out for you. Oh, hello, James, the glowworm said, looking down and giving James a little wave and a smile. I didn't see you come in. Welcome, my dear boy, welcome, and good night. Then click, out went the light. There's the glowworm up here. And I believe, yep, there's James right down there looking at the glowworm up top. See how that doesn't really look like a worm? She has all those legs. Lady Firefly without wings. I never knew that. James Henry Trotter lay there in the darkness with his eyes wide open, listening to the strange sleeping noises that the creatures were making all around him, and wondering what on earth was going to happen to him in the morning. Already he was beginning to like his new friends very much. They were not only nearly as terrible as they looked. They were not nearly as terrible as they looked. In fact, they weren't really terrible at all. They seemed extremely kind and helpful in spite of all the shouting and arguing that went on between them. Good night, old green grasshopper, he whispered. Good night, Ladybug. Good night, Miss Spider. But before he could go through all of them, he had fallen fast asleep. Chapter 14. We're off, someone was shouting. We're off at last. James woke up with a jump and looked around him. The creatures were all out of their hammocks and moving excitedly around the room. Suddenly, the floor gave a great heave as though an earthquake were taking place. Here we go, shouted the old green grasshopper, hopping up and down with excitement. Hold on tight. What's happening? Cried James, leaping out of his hammock. What's going on? The ladybug, who was obviously a kind and gentle creature, came over and stood beside him. In case you don't know it, she said, we are about to depart forever. From the top of this ghastly hill that we've all been living on for so long, we are about to roll away inside of this great, big, beautiful peach to a land of what? Asked James. Never you mind, said the ladybug, but nothing could be worse than this desolate hilltop and those two repulsive aunts of yours. Hear, hear, they all shouted. Hear, hear. You may not have noticed, the ladybug went on, but the whole garden, even before it reaches the steep edge of the hill, happens to be on a steep slope. And therefore, the only thing that has been stopping this peach from rolling away right from the beginning is the thick stem attaching it to the tree. Break the stem, and off we go. Watch it, cried Miss Spider as the room gave another violent lurch. Here we go. Not quite, not quite. At this moment, continued the ladybug, our centipede, who has a pair of jaws as sharp as razors, is up there on the top of the peach, nibbling away at the stem. In fact, he must be nearly through it, as you can tell from the way we're lurching about. Would you like me to take you under my wing so that you won't fall over when we start rolling? That's very kind of you, said James, but I think I'll be all right. Just then, the centipede stuck his grinning face through the hole in the ceiling and shouted, I've done it! We're off! We're off! The others cried, We're off! The journey begins, shouted the centipede. And who knows where it'll end, muttered the earthworm. If you have anything to do with it, it can only mean trouble. Here's the centipede coming out of the top. See some of his boots coming out. Nonsense, said the ladybug. We are now about to visit the most marvelous places and see the most wonderful things. Isn't that so, Centipede? There is no knowing what we shall see, cried Centipede. We may see a creature with 49 heads who lives in a desolate snow, and whenever he catches a cold which he dreads, he has 49 noses to blow. We may see the venomous pink-spotted scrunch who can chew up a man in one bite. It likes to eat 5 of them roasted for lunch and 18 for supper at night. We may see a dragon that nobody knows, that we won't see a unicorn there. We may see a terrible monster with toes growing out of the tufts of his hair. We may see the sweet, biggity, bright hen, so playful, so kind and well-bred, and such beautiful eggs, you just boil them then. They explode when they blow off your head. A new and rhinoceros surely you'll see, and that enormous and honorable gnat, who's sitting when it stings you, goes in at the knee and comes out through the top of your hat. We may even get lost and be frozen by frost. We may die in an earthquake or tremor, Or nastier still, we may even be tossed in the horns of a furious dilemma. But who cares? Let us go from this horrible hill. Let us roll, let us bowl, let us plunge. Let's go rolling and bowling and spinning until we're away from old Spiker and Sponge. 1 second later, slowly, insidiously, almost gently, the great peach started to lean forward and steal into motion. The whole room began to tilt over, and the furniture went sliding across the floor and crashed against the far wall. So did James, and the ladybug, the old grasshopper, and Miss Spider and the earthworm, also the centipede, who had just come slithering quickly down the wall. And that's where we'll stop. We will continue with chapter 15 soon. And I wanted to let you know, also, boys and girls, today is Miss Cooper's birthday. So if you have a way to reach out to Miss Cooper, do that. Wish her a happy birthday. All right. Mwah. I miss you. Go outside and play. Hurry before it starts raining. All right. Love you.